Hello, everyone. Welcome to the eighth and the final episode of this series of talks with Liberty Books on the stained glass window. I'm Taha Kehar, the co-editor of this compilation, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce my guests. But before I do that, I'd like to speak a little bit about our topic for the day. The title of this session is Notes on the Pandemic, which I felt is sufficiently open ended for the stories we're going to discuss today, because each of them are diverse. They are perceptions on the pandemic, how it has influenced people on a personal level. And I felt it was integral to have a topic that was seemingly vast. So I'm going to begin by introducing my guests, and then we'll ask them some great questions about their stories. So we have Shabano Alvi, and Shabano Alvi is a graduate in graphic design from the Department of Art and Design at the University of Punjab, Lahore. She has exhibited her woodcuts and portraits in pastel both nationally and internationally. She is also the founder and publisher of an independent publishing house, Pushpa, and she writes stories in Urdu and in English and has translated works from Urdu and English. And I believe she's translated a lot of Amir Hussein's stories as well. She also has a short story collection coming out very soon. I don't know the exact title of the collection. If you'd like to share that.
It's called A Woman in the Afternoon Sun.
A Woman in the Afternoon. And right next to her is Natasha Japanwala, who is a writer and educator based in Karachi, though at the moment she is in the US and has joined us at 6 a.m. I don't know if you've had your morning coffee, but I'm glad you're here. Then right next to me on the screen is Safina Danishilahi, who is a writer and an early learning educator. Her debut novel, Eye on the Prize, has been published by Liberty Publishing. And she's also penned a collection of poems titled The Unbridled Romance of Love and Pain, which was published by Markings in Lahore. And she's also completed a novel very recently, I believe. So
yeah, sorry, I
good luck for that.
When to unmute myself. Thank you, Taha. Thank you for the generous.
So all of you have stories in this compilation, The Stained Glass Window, and I was just wondering what inspired your stories, apart from the prompt that we gave you. Who would like to go first?
Well, when you asked me, sorry, I was really in a very difficult situation because, of course, for 3-4 months we had been housebound. There was the lockdown, and interestingly, being in this solitary state, one tends to go back into time. One wants to, stay in the present, and there are so many thoughts and stories resonating in one's mind. So when you asked me for it, that was all I had, just to go back into my mind and try and write something of what was going on around me.
That's lovely. So was it difficult to get your creative juices flowing, or did it just happen instinctively?
In this case, it was not very difficult because, interestingly, I had been working on this collection of mine, and I had written a lot of stories. I had started writing in English first, and then after writing about 25 or 26 stories, I started writing in Urdu. So I was in the process of writing when you had asked me. So it was not difficult, very difficult. Plus, the situation all around was weighing heavy on one's mind. So it was relatively okay to come
That's
up with
great. What about the rest of you? Who would like to go next?
I can go. I mean, I was reflecting on this story ahead of this event, and I think that like the pandemic or the lockdown, so to say, or whatever you want to refer to this past sort of year, almost year as, hasn't been steady, right? Like in different countries, there have been ebbs and flows of cases, there have been ebbs and flows of anxieties and hopes. And I think when I wrote this story in the summer, it was around the time that things were genuinely getting a little bit better in Pakistan. Like cases were falling, people were beginning to step out again. There was this hope that in the fall life would return to normal. And and that happened for like a very brief time, and even then it wasn't a complete return, but there was this sort of like, oh, we're beginning to sort of adjust back to life the way it was, cases are going down, and then it just all skyrocketed again. And now I look back on this story, which is sort of about a young woman looking back at the anxiety of being isolated and not seeing people around her, and finally stepping out again with her friends. And I look back at that, and that hasn't for me aged well, because I think that now we're in the third or whatever, in whatever number in whichever country you are, we're in the deepest, most horrific winter lockdown, or winter surge of the pandemic. That, like, I think that more cases, hospitals are full again. It's the deadliest surge, and I think what is painful for me looking back on this story is people are still behaving as if things are going to be okay and causing cases to surge when people should be back where they were at the very beginning of the lockdown, at home, not stepping out. And I think
Fascinating.
yeah, and so
Though I do feel your story ages well, I don't think it hasn't aged well in the last 6 months. I think it's a very powerful glimpse into the early days of the pandemic, when there was a great deal of uncertainty and there was fear, but there was also a desire to return to the normal. So I don't think it hasn't aged well. I think it's a beautiful
thanks,
story.
but I guess what I'm saying is that like I have
Yeah,
so much more to say at this point,
yeah.
because
I'm
we
going to
couldn't
get
in
to
the summer
that
have
because I
imagined
have
that
want
all
to
of this
ask
would
you
happen.
guys about how you would write your stories now if you were asked to do it.
I'll save
So,
my
Safina,
thoughts
what
for
do you have
then.
to say?
So I remember, Taha, that I think my story was one of the earliest submissions. So I think I wrote it around May. Yes, and that was basically the peak of the pandemic in Pakistan. And obviously I'm going to be writing, talking about my character later in the discussion as well. But I thought that it was interesting that all of us were feeling, anxious in our own sort of environment, skin, there was so much going on. People didn't know much about the pandemic yet. We were still spraying everything, because I mean, at this point, in December, January, we stopped spraying things. We stopped, the research showed that materials were not to carry, the COVID germs into the house. So at that point, I feel that, the information was also such that nobody really knew what this this virus entailed. We didn't really know much. So I thought it was interesting to sort of write from a perspective that was nowhere near mine. As you know, that the story that I wrote also was from the help that we have. And I think it was just I think as a writer one needs to be extremely empathetic, because not all characters that you write are actually depicting your own personality. So at that time, and I was editing my novel at the same time, so I thought this was going to be a slightly different narrative than my already published book. That it's just a complete contrast. And then obviously the conditions were completely different. This was in lockdown, everything was from home. I teach, my kids were at home, the husband was at home, so there was like this manic of this happening at home. There are too many things happening, and at the same time, you need to shut yourself somewhere where you can sort of align your thoughts as well. So it was an interesting time, I'd say.
That's lovely. So now I'll get to your characters because Safina has mentioned it. How would you describe the struggles that your protagonists go through in your respective stories to someone who's not acquainted with your story? If you were to give like a bit of a teaser, can we start with you, Shabana? What would you like to tell prospective readers about your stories?
Well, it's actually not about a particular person. I have tried to convey the feeling of overall fear and uncertainty, and how, like you say, the protagonist is going to deal with it. So the person goes back into the past, and it's what I've tried to do in the story is to bridge a gap between the generation that's gone and the generation that the future generation. You see, and what I want to show in the story is that human nature and human qualities of courage or of perseverance or of getting support or getting a sort of you know a sort of support from from your thoughts or from your parents to and taking it to your children. It is just it's just bridging a gap between the 3-4 generations and focusing on the human nature, as human nature would deal with such circumstances. So it's more about general human quality.
Excellent. And we'll get to the details of this story. Shabano's story is called My Turn, and as she mentions, it's about it's a bridge between two generations. So we'll get to that in more detail. Natasha, your story, A Slice of Once Open Sky. What can you tell us about your story? Very briefly, just a bit of a teaser.
So, my story is about a young woman who has recently been divorced and is really struggling during the pandemic, being away from her friends. And I think, Safina, you spoke about your nuclear family, your husband and your children, and there's all sorts of, dynamics to be thought about there, being locked down with your family. Shabano, you spoke about generations leaning on one another. I think what I was interested in my story was this other form of family, when your friends are your family, and how in the lockdown where you weren't able to leave your house, that support network just sort of crumbled, and the difficulties of that. And it was meant to be an ode really to the power of friendships to uplift us and comfort us, and the way that that was taken away for many people.
Very interesting.
Excellent. Safina?
Yes, sorry. So I'd like to talk a little bit about my protagonist. Her name's Shaheen. She's a part-time worker. Her husband is a driver, and they belong to a community of people who really, really work hard to make ends meet. I think with my character, what I tried to do was to understand that how the economic conditions affected them, because all of us, we had sort of shut down our doors. We were keeping to ourselves, cooking, baking, writing. So, and I mean, I feel that at this time, privilege was a word that was thrown around quite a bit, and I wanted to really delve into the idea that we were, for example, I myself, I'd say, oh, I was cleaning, I was ironing, I was cooking, but what was it like to be out of a job, while the bajis and everybody said that they're going to be paying the help in full, but they did, we heard that they did deduct for half the month or the entire month that the part-time help was sent away, because they were meeting their relatives and their families. So everybody was scared that the virus was going to be brought into the house. So just how that family dealt with the pandemic, because more than anything, I think their survival was more important. They didn't really care about the virus as much as they did about their daily food in the house, medicine in the house. and just sort of their logistics of getting to work, coming back, how they were going to manage their household when they're either laid off or just sent away for a little while. So Shaheen is in a bad spot. I mean, she really really suffers. So once I talk about a little more into the story, I'll enlighten the
Big spoilers when you
viewers,
discuss the story.
what the story is actually
So,
about.
so Shabanu, your story, My Turn, it deals with how the restrictions of the lockdown made people question their relationship with the past and the present. And in many ways, you have explored that through a parent-child relationship and how it can provide us with comfort, it could provide us with some degree of security. How did you go about with that? Well, would you like to say something about the parent-child relationship in your story?
Well, the main character in my story is a middle-aged woman, and she went through her own dark areas of her life because, as with everyone else, of course, there's a section of our society that stays inside the house, but most of us are outside the house doing our work, meeting our friends, just filling our day with different activities. So once when you were inside and you are a certain age, you are a 60 plus person, you realize that it's very easy to give up hope, and it's very easy to start going towards the depression because there are no outside things that are there to take your attention away from yourself. So you are focused on yourself all the time. So I wanted to find out a solution, and I wanted to give people a solution that when you're totally, absolutely alone and you have no distractions whatsoever, then what do you do to lift up your spirits? It's very difficult. And so that is when I thought that if you go into your past and if you pick up pieces of good memories, pieces of instances which gave you courage, pieces of life which was good, and then you took courage from that, and then you tried to transfer to your child the same feeling so that she doesn't have to look at the outside distractions for her to come out of her depression. All she would need to do is to look at the strength inside her, which is there in everyone, which is there in your life, maybe not all the time, but in instances, in happenings, in the memories of your loved ones. So if you stop, there was this chance of stopping yourself to be dependent on outside influences for your inner strength. Instead, you could go inside yourself and bring out your own different memories to give yourself strength and bring yourself outside of your depression or your feeling of a low feeling. And like Natasha said that you're also not intermingling with your friends, and friends are a big part of your. So that is what I've tried to express through the story, that in this time, what is a really silver lining is that people have perforce learned to depend on themselves for their own well-being and strength and confidence.
That's lovely. So, Safina, your story also has a parent-child relationship, but it's not as hopeful as My Turn, Shabano's story. Would you like to talk a little bit about the parent-child relationship in your story in a spoiler-free manner?
Yes, I'll try my best not to put any spoilers, but I was scared you're going to say that my story was a bit too gloomy. It really, I think it was when I was writing it as well, it was a little bit too heartbreaking. And I considered, turning the notch down a bit, but then I thought, I wouldn't do justice to it. So yes, Shaheen also is a mother of 4 children, and the children are looked after by sort of her, community of other mothers that live near her colony, inside her colony. So she has a younger one who also, she's fallen sick as well. She's 1.5, and then there are her older children who go to madrasa, and their madrasa also closes down. So her relationship with her children is like any mother's would be, but it's just that in in our country or in that sort of social strata, you don't really have daycares, or you don't really have the husband staying at home and looking after the children. So the children are sort of just looked after by neighbors or the older sister, who's 8 or 9. She's looking after maybe the 7-year-old, or they're just around, and she has a part-time job, so she can't really stay into the house. She can't live in the house that she's working at, but she is leaving them for a couple of hours, and obviously she's very concerned. And with the lockdown, she goes, she stays with the children there, but she has, she struggles. She struggles with running the household, the added expense of buying masks, that the employers require. So there's this really, entangled relationship, I'd say. Both the husband and wife work, and they obviously care for the children as well, but it's just a different sort of what do you say, looking after that we know of.
That's great. So, Natasha, your story also has an element of the past in it. You mentioned, I'll get to the past later, but you mentioned that Hira, your character, considers her friends to be her family. But what is her equation with the world? Is it one of complete admiration for everything around her, or is it something that she struggles with? What is her equation with the world, especially during the lockdown? Is she, yeah.
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think she is a character who sometimes feels ostracized by the world around her and seeks its beauty as a comfort from that alienation she feels. I think that for many people, their relationship with the world around them shifted during lockdown because they weren't able to access the world around them. So then their relationship with the world became, in many ways, their relationship with the world they used to know, which is to say, a relationship with their past.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a really interesting space for a character and a human being, right? Where you're living in a reality that is very dystopian, and so sort of the only world you can really access is a world that no longer exists.
Interesting. So when you talk about the past and this relationship with the past, she's had relationships in the past, like, I'm not going to give anything away, but the marriage that never really worked out, and that relationship with that, there's a specific scene where she sees her former mother-in-law at a party a few weeks before the lockdown, and she's wearing her jewelry, and I just wanted to know how her past relationships have prepared her for the lockdown.
I think what I was trying to get at with that scene in particular was the lockdown sort of messed with the timeline of her healing, right? That like she was, that memory is sort of like her coming out of this disastrous relationship and revisiting that memory in lockdown, I think, is her way of asking herself what has happened to that timeline of her healing. Because in lockdown, the worst memories start revisiting her, and she starts questioning everything. Who wouldn't when you're locked in a room by yourself? So I think what I was trying to create in that scene where she's alone in her room is sort of her demons entering her present.
Excellent. So Shabanu, your story, my turn, deals with the past and the bridge between the past and the present. But was it easy to navigate that in a short story? Because you have your story is structured perfectly. It has section marks that inform the reader about which part of, like, I think there's a portion where it is in 1999. There's a portion that is much
Yeah.
later. Was it easy to keep that flow going as from a strictly, you know, creative point of view and in terms of craft?
You see, Taha, I have not had any lessons in story writing. Basically, I've never been a student of language. So what I write basically comes from my experiences, and then I tend to look at those experiences and knit them into a single instance story. You see, I look at it. So that's where my stories come from. So for me, it was not difficult because I don't know anything about the formal craft of the story writing. I'm not very
I
proud
find
of
that
the
hard to
fact, but
believe
the thing
because
is, for
the
me,
story. Yeah.
no, I like you when you read out. I am basically a visual artist, but
Uh-huh.
somewhere along the line, because ever since I was 7 or 8 years old, I've been reading stories, and I've been reading stories not just in English but in Urdu, and to some extent a little bit of Bengali, but because we used to live in East Pakistan, in what was then East Pakistan, and now it's Bangladesh. So I've read a lot of stories. So for me, writing those instances has not been difficult. That's how I have stories in my mind. And I must say that when I started writing 3 years back, I just wrote out of compulsion. I had to write because of certain events that happened around me, and because I couldn't talk about those, so I had to write. When I wrote and I showed those stories to Amir, who's a good friend, he was very encouraging, and that since he encouraged me, and I thought he's such a good story writer, then that means I can keep on writing in the same way that I've written. So I don't know what when you say the craft of the story, I think I don't, frankly, I don't understand all that. I'm just an instinctive writer. So
So
it
from
was not.
since you're a visual artist, how much of that goes into
I
writing?
think I think a lot. If you look at my stories and all my stories, in fact, my new book that's going to come, inshallah, I think I bring a lot of visual scenes into my stories. So my stories are not just words; they are a combination of the visuals around me and the happenings around me. So I enjoy doing that. In a way, it's something that I really and truly enjoy because it brings the two very important things together: my love of stories, reading stories, and my love of the visuals around me. So I think my stories are
Fascinating.
very.
They are extremely visual. I've read one in addition to the one you sent to us, and they
Yes.
are extremely visual. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Safina, your story deals with the miseries experienced by the very poor during the pandemic. And I just wanted to know, you tell this story from a first person perspective. Was it difficult to inhabit the skin of a domestic worker and faithfully present her point of view? And would the story be any different if it was told from another perspective, or maybe from Shaheen's employer's perspective?
So yes, Taha, I feel that to deliver it faithfully would just be the reader's verdict, because I mean I tried my
Uh-huh.
best, but the reader will really be able to tell if I've done a good job or I've been faithful in delivering that perspective. I am, empathetic, and I do perceive feelings as a person as well. And I try to do that because, as running households, we do interact on quite a large basis with our help. I
Mhm.
regularly talk to, they're like my sisters or my friends in the house. So I do hear their grievances and I do have a conversation with them. quite like regularly. So I tried to incorporate that, my knowledge of how they live and how, what kind of grievances they have. So yes, I tried to do that. And if the story was from the perspective of the employer, then it would obviously be completely different, because the employer would have a perspective of how the lockdown is on her. Much like, if I tell my story, I would say that, oh, I did this and I did that and I did this in
But
my
would the story
time at home.
have an elitist overtone if it was just the employer's perspective? Do you feel?
It might, depending on I feel that these days the reader also perceives the writer's perspective in a way that they think that the writer is trying to say this. So maybe the employer is also does not also belong to an elite household.
Hmm.
It could just be that she's employing part-time help, and a lot of people employ part-time help, but
Exactly.
the reader will then be able to sort of judge that is the story really elitist, or it's just a normal person who gets a little bit of extra help in the house. But it would definitely be different, because the living arrangement is going to be completely different, right?
Exactly.
How Shaheen deals with her relationship with her husband, her relationship with her children, her job. So all these things are definitely going to be different for if the story was from Farzana Baji's perspective. So I
Perspective.
did try to incorporate,
So,
yeah, I did try to incorporate little things like, things that we don't think about. For example, the cost of the masks. We still get boxes of masks and, think of it as a necessity. We wouldn't step out without it. But for someone who's earning 10, 12,000 in a month, that's obviously a chunk of their salary. If it's 350 rupees a week, or of the likes, it's still significant.
exactly. Natasha, I'll come to you and then we'll ask a very general question to everyone. So your character Hira feels like the lockdown. There's an interesting line in your story that says that the lockdown has rendered her anonymous in a city where she was often too visible. What can you tell me about that? It's a very interesting way of looking at the lockdown. Do you think more people can relate to that sentiment? Is it, yeah?
That's just a very odd sentence. I don't know what I meant by it. Um, but also, I mean, cities are fascinating places that render all of us anonymous, the big ones anyway,
Uh-huh.
right? Um, Karachi is a particularly unique city, which is both massive and tiny both massive but feels
Uh-huh.
tiny at the same time, right? Like, it is population wise one of the biggest cities in the world, but I feel like so many people in Karachi exist in silos that feel like, small towns. Um, and so, I think in the world in which Hira lives, she was very visible. And I think as a young woman, felt policed, felt judged, felt like she had to fulfill expectations, felt like she was attracting unwanted attention everywhere she went. And I think all of those tensions and pressures are a constant negotiation of making a life for yourself in a city like Karachi.
Mhm.
You don't have the luxury of being anonymous when you're going about your day-to-day life. Um,
Mhm.
but in the lockdown, I wonder if she misses those negotiations as a way of saying, like,
Interesting.
does she miss, like, in the lockdown, maybe it became hard for her to be anonymous in the way she used to long to be. Although the caveat is that she can't be anonymous in the public sphere anymore. She's just anonymous in her home, and in that way, everybody became anonymous um,
Interesting.
in their own private spaces.
Excellent. So this is a question to all of you. I can sort of preempt some answers to this, but I just wanted to know that your main characters, obviously not all of your stories have one character, one central character, but there is a protagonist in each of your stories. And I was just wondering if you considered them to be optimists or pessimists during this lockdown era. Who would like to go first?
Well, I can say that I have never been much of a pessimist, and I've always looked at life with a lot of hope and a lot of optimism, which is why when we were going through this lockdown, I wanted to look at the silver linings around, and I wanted to bring those hopeful things to the fore and let people know about it, which I think shows in my story. In fact, I don't think I am not a pessimist person. So even in the lockdown, I think if we try to, we can look at the silver lining. It can come from anywhere, inside you, outside.
Safina, what do you have to say?
So
Your character goes through the most.
yes, so I think as
adversity.
far as my character is concerned, being in the situation that she's in, she's not particularly pessimist, but she's just a realist. You know, she has to make ends meet. She's just concerned about her job, you know, not being. She's just, you know, it's uncertain time, so she doesn't know that if you know, her baji is going to employ her back again. She's just confused when she's not let into the house and told that, you know, part-time help is not welcome anymore. So she's just, you know, she's just it's just uncertain if she's going to be employed again, who's going to employ her if her old, you know, employer doesn't. So she's just trying to, you know, take it one day at a time, you know, looking after the children, multiple responsibilities. You know, there's a sick child in the home, there's the husband that she's got loans, the husband's also not paid well enough, you know, they're quite obviously below the minimum wage, you know, of Pakistan. There are no checks and balances on, you know, who's paying how much to their help. So with that all in mind, I think she's just a realist. You know, she can't be too optimistic in her situation.
So she's completely resigned to whatever happens to her.
Well, I mean, she does try, right? She does try explaining her perspective, and you know, she just tries communicating to her employer that she is in a lot of debt and she does need money to sort of run her day-to-day expenses. But it's just that you know, it's slightly sad that somehow we don't really take you know, their word when our help asks us for money or for help. We usually think that it's excuses, or you know, they're just making things up because you're also in sort of in a rut. I feel, you know, in the lockdown everybody was sort of their I wouldn't say worst kind, but they were still, you know, everybody was feeling anxious, so I think they didn't really put their best foot forward.
Interesting. Natasha? Is Hira an optimist?
Oh, I unmuted. I think she is. I think the lockdown first sort of startles her, as it did us all. And then she's an optimist. She finds ways to find beauty again in her day-to-day life. Not to give the ending away, but when the story, it's a 2-page story. When the story
It's not a
ends,
2-page story, but okay.
it's like 3-4 pages, you know, like it's okay. I think I give the ending away. Like in the end, she's like, oh, let me start a community vegetable garden outside my house. Like, let me put up a bird feeder. And I think that that's an optimism a lot of people experience, where they were like, you know, what little things can I do to bring joy back into my life? But I think what Safina was saying was very interesting, is optimism is a privilege. Like, you know, I think it's much harder to be optimistic if the pandemic hit you with a series of circumstances that deeply challenged you, whether it was your health or the health of your loved ones or your economic stability. I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I'm grateful for the variety of characters in this anthology, because it means that we're not presenting a collective monolithic experience of this huge global event that will be remembered for many, many years.
So all three of your stories are stories of survival during the initial days of the lockdown. Now, what if you were given this prompt, today, tomorrow, or something like that, now, in the very present moment? Would your stories be any different, or would you follow the same arc? Would you be exploring the same themes? What would you guys have to say about that?
I couldn't hear your question. I think we went off.
Oh, so I was just saying that these are stories of survival that talk about the initial days of the lockdown and the pandemic. But how different would your stories be now if you were asked to write them?
Okay. Natasha, you were going to answer that?
Yeah, you were
I thought you were going to go. I think I'm really holding to the order we started with, which was you, Shabana, and then me.
Break the order.
I feel very. But I can.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'll do that. Actually, if I were to, now that we are well into this whole period, what I have realized is that there are two types of people around us. One, who are called the privileged people, they have their own inside demons to fight, and the other, who are the underprivileged people, those people who have got the more practical problems around them. They have also found a way of to be optimistic about their circumstances, because they now refuse to acknowledge the fact that there is a pandemic around. They just say, "वो तो खत्म हो गई." Yani ke, when I asked, I told my maid servant that you have to put on your mask, and when you go for shopping, do you have your mask on? And she says, we are the only person in our colony who put our masks on, because the other ones say कि इनको देखो, इनके लिए तो अभी वो pandemic ही चल रही है. So, people are now, the human mind is so fertile that to grasp onto a silver lining, they find different ways and different situations and different, reasons to get themselves out of that deep, dark, desolate situation that actually we all are in. But human nature tends to survive. I think that's how they survive, by picking at different silver straws. So I think now, if I was to write a story, I would be writing about how human nature can survive pandemics through the strength of their mind's hope.
And I believe that when you sent us a story, this particular story, you had sent us something before as well. It was a relatively shorter version of another story. Maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about that, because that was also a somewhat pandemic story.
It was actually, I thought of that story when I was in March, right when the whole thing had started. I was traveling from London to Karachi. And what I saw around me was very intriguing and very educating. So that's where I thought of this story. And it was very short. Like you said, it's too short. But that's how it was, during that traveling time, that I thought of it and I wrote it.
Excellent. Who'd like to go next? You can break the order, guys. You don't need to.
Just one more thing, because I would like to say here that I have come across instances of such great human. I have found people all around have started being more kind to each other during this pandemic.
That's interesting.
And I would like to write about that too.
That is something that ought to be written about.
Mhm.
Who would like to go next? Yeah.
Giovanna, I think that's a beautiful sentiment, right? Like the ways in which we've learned to be kinder to each other. And it's something I've definitely seen as well. But I think if I were to rewrite my story now, or if I were to just grapple with a new set of themes, I think a lot of people are in a very sort of disillusioned place right now with the trajectory of the pandemic. Like I think a lot of, maybe because it's the start of a new year, everybody was like, "Yeah, 2020 is over." Like, actually 2021 is still the same world, still the same pandemic.
No, you're right.
And
Yeah.
and I think what we're experiencing now, I think as a world, we will find a way to snap back when things eventually return to the way they used to be. But I think the way things are has gone on long enough that it is permanently going to change our outlook on things. And I'm very curious to see like what will endure of this time and what will fall away.
Mhm.
Interesting. Very well put. Safina, what do you have to say? How would your story change?
I'll just put this disclaimer first that by no means was I meaning to, and would I ever belittle anybody's struggle. I feel that just because, my narrative was from a person who belonged to a community, an underprivileged community, I will not, be mistaken to believe that, the privileged had an easier time. I mean, I know of people who struggle with loneliness, with anxiety,
Yes,
with
everyone has
just
their own.
staying at home. So, by no means would I belittle anybody's struggle. If I were to write, in this month or the present day, I think, try to experiment with a comic narrative because, I mean, I don't know if many people know about this, but I did belong to a stand-up comic group as well. So,
I did not
uh,
know that. So
yes, so I mean, I've never written in a humorous manner, so it'd be interesting to see if I can. But like Shabana also said that the sentiment has changed. There's been kindness. There's been really hilarious stories as well. During the pandemic, and I know Taha that your story deals with something like that. So I
we're not
think
here
if
to
I were
talk
to
about it.
write, yeah, but if I were to write today, I might experiment with a not so gloomy side of my writing.
Fair enough. It's interesting. So I was just wondering if you'd like to read from your stories, maybe a short passage from your stories before we dive into some of the comments people have left.
Sure, I think Shabano will stick to the order and have you go first.
All right. Let me take it out. Uh, oh, just let me. I had taken. Okay. So I'll write a little. I'll read from here.
Gee.
And then there is this lockdown. Slowly, everything started to close: shops, restaurants, malls, hotels, and then transport, flights, trains, except the essential groceries and medical stores, and those too for a certain time. Social contact and proximity diminished and then dwindled. Human touch was taboo. It has become the biggest public health challenge the world has faced in recent memory. Fast track research for an anti COVID 19 vaccine has commenced, as have conspiracy theories flourished, giving way to a nameless horror. Ignorance breeds fear, and here and now, anybody in the world has no clear idea about COVID 19. The world is living in fear. We are afraid. Ruby has COVID 19. Sarah, my daughter, burst into my room. What? I'm startled out of my despondency. Has she had herself tested for it? No, no. Why? How does she know that then? Well, she suspects and she has isolated herself since yesterday. She's a doctor. I look at my daughter incredulously. I know she's a doctor, which is why she should get the test done. Well, there are issues. Stigmas attached to it. She cannot go out as that would expose others to the risk, and they cannot have somebody come to get her blood test as. Why? Well, she lives in a joint family system, and her father-in-law feels that if somebody comes to the house for a COVID-19 blood test, the neighbors would know and might ostracize them. So they've asked her to just isolate herself and take all the precautions. Ostracize them? Social contact is taboo, so she'll never know and live in a sort of dread. I look at Sarah and she stares back. I can see a shadow of fear lurking in her eyes as she turns and goes out of the room. I sit quietly looking out of the window. I could feel a panic rising from the pit of my stomach. It has been 3 months under this lockdown. I haven't stepped out of my house at all. Neither do I want to now.
Excellent.
I think that should be enough.
Yeah. Who would like to go next? Natasha, were you following the
Yeah, I didn't mean
order?
us to follow this order like for the rest of time, but I guess I'll,
It just so
I guess
happened.
I'll go. Shabano, that was lovely.
Yeah.
That was beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'll read a short excerpt from my story, which is sort of set time-wise in the very early stages of the first lockdown. The small pockets in her day started disappearing. Groceries were delivered, the dog walked up and down the barricaded street instead of at the park, and late ice cream drives halted. Everyone she knew had signed up for a free online class to learn how to code, use Photoshop, or play the guitar. She didn't have the focus to do any of these things. I may be an asymptomatic carrier, she explained to her parents over the intercom, excusing herself from mealtimes, card games on a folding table on the terrace, and Netflix screenings in the TV lounge. I will quarantine in my bedroom for 14 days. Food was left outside her room on a tray 3 times a day. She threw a lot of it away, never able to finish the heaped plates even partially. Time blurred. All she did was sleep, dispose of her food, feel guilty for disposing of her food, and pretend she was okay when friends messaged to ask how she was getting on. I'm an introvert. I don't need anyone around me, her friend Imad announced in a voice note. He had been traveling back in time, visiting old rooms in his mind, obsessing over where he might have ended up if the millions of moments that surround big decisions had been even slightly different. What if I had read something else that day, or met someone who altered my mood, even fleetingly? What if I heard about a new opportunity, felt pulled to a new city or career or self? Hira did not respond. Her path could never have been as whimsically altered, or at least it did not feel like that in retrospect.
Excellent.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Safina, now it's
Yeah.
you.
So I'm just going to explain because this is literally in the middle of the story. I just like this passage, so I selected it. This is when Shaheen goes back to her employer after almost a month and asks for her due salary, and it's a bit crude, but it's just part of the story. Here you go, she says. So this is Farzana Baji saying, handing her money. My heart did a somersault as I held the crisp notes in my hand. Though I hadn't earned the money, I desperately needed it to make ends meet. As I tucked the money into my purse, I realized that something was amiss. Baji, you've only given me 6,000 rupees. What more do you want? Farzana Baji said, her face crimson with anger. Do you really think I was going to pay you for work that you haven't done? I've been sweeping floors myself. You have no shame. Baji, I didn't ask you to sweep floors, I said, holding back my tears. I would never let you sweep floors. But you're the one who told me to stay at home. I have to feed my children, Baji. What am I supposed to do? Faika doesn't stop crying. She hasn't even been taking her milk. I need enough money to buy medicines for her and food for the other children. Shaheen, these are just excuses. How can you not have money for food? How expensive is all this food you people eat? What did you do with the money I've been giving you all these years? Last year, I gave you 20,000 rupees to build a bathroom. What happened to that money? We built a bathroom with it, Baji.
Very nice. I was going to say.
Interesting. Interesting.
Very nice.
You do have a comic element in you.
That was
Safina, so I look
excellent.
forward to
It just felt so funny that, the lady is saying that, I don't have money. to feed my children, and she's referring to, some zakat that she might have taken out, a year ago to build a bathroom. So obviously that money was used to build a bathroom,
So these were some excellent readings, and I think it's been great. We have a lot of comments pouring in, but I'll keep interspersing them. This one is for Shahbano. I completely agree with this pandemic. Everyone who's known about the narration of kindness, जो हमें खत्म हो चुकी है. That's very true. The narrative of kindness,
Yes.
narration of kindness, the idea of being generous to each other. It's something that's lost, and I think we're sort of reviving it in a way. So lovely. And as the comments keep pouring in, I just wanted to ask you guys, what are you writing next?
Well, actually, I have not written anything as yet, but I want to share a very interesting thought, which is that as I was, in the lockdown, I was sitting at home, not getting out. I realized that, the women in our society who are perforce made to stay in the house, their minds slowly close because they are not allowed to come out of the house. And that is when they start being petty, and they start getting into the trivialities of anger and, so, being in this lockdown situation, I think we should realize that this is something that has made us come on par with women who were not allowed of their houses to some extent, not to a lot. And we can identify of what they must have gone through, not because they didn't have the personality or the strength to fight it, but simply because they were cut off from the outside world. And their world was just those four walls they were sitting in, like ours had become. Our minds had also stopped thinking on that scale that we used to when we were used to going out of the house. I don't know whether I've explained
That's so true.
it well, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I'm going to write something about that.
I think what's really interesting about what you said, Shahbano, is that in many ways we are relegated to the household sphere again. But I wonder, and this is something I think might be interesting to explore in your stories, I wonder how our access to the online sphere is changing our relationship with the external world. So I think many decades ago, women could be within the household sphere and not feel empowered. But I think now they kind of have the world at their fingertips if they choose to engage with it. So what plot twists might that invite?
But even for that, Natasha, I would say that it's not the same thing, because then you are just passively looking at your computer screen, maybe talking to people, but your mind is not opening as it does when you go out, smell the air, look at people interacting with others. It is something that is essential for every human being. And I think that is what we need to bring out now for a certain section of the women in our society, because we've lived it to some extent, not to the extent that they've been living it, but yes, to some extent. So
I agree with you. That is very important.
I want to explore that.
I look forward to reading your next work.
What would the both of you like to explore? We'll get to Mudassir's comment, but first, just very briefly, Safina, Natasha, what would you like to write next, or what are you writing next?
Sorry, Natasha, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think that, honestly, Shahbano, you touched on this a bit earlier. I think Taha had asked, what inspired the story? I don't know, but you had mentioned, we talked a little bit about whether it was easy or not easy to write in these circumstances. And I think every writer has had a different approach. The time at home has been productive for some. And I think the anxiety of the pandemic has been, not productive for others. And I think for most part of the pandemic, have fallen in the latter camp. I think it's been hard for me to focus. So in terms of what I'm working on next, I think I'm just trying to set up a practice where I'm writing every day. I give myself small prompts. I hold myself to 25 minutes because 30 minutes feels too long. So, 25 minutes I try to do every day. It's, so like on harder days, I'll journal a bit for 25 minutes, but I'll try to make it like a good entry. And then on other days, I'll work on a project. And I think for me, it's about holding myself to that habit. I think one generally really useful piece of advice a friend gave me is that, it's better to give yourself to set habits rather than goals. So
Oh,
that's
yes.
what I've been doing with my writing.
I think I agree with that. Yeah.
Safina,
So, I mean, again, there's homeschooling going on, there is work from home going on, so there's one big party at home. But within that party, I did manage to finish writing a manuscript. It's a very raw, manuscript at the moment. Obviously, it has a lot of, I have a lot of work to do on it, and I'm also hoping to. I've been working on it to establish a publishing platform, just something that can do more things like Liberty has done, like Taha and Sana have managed to do. I think like Chavano and Natasha both said that women who have been at home, they don't get to interact and they don't get to explore as many ideas as women who step out of the house do. And I think encouraging reading and writing also sort of opens that avenue for people to explore different perspectives within the home as well. So if we can do that, if we can encourage reading and writing within women and men and children for that matter, and they do say that reading has gone up during the pandemic because a lot of people were locked in at home. I think if I can do my little bit in encouraging that, that'd be like a huge deal for me. So that's just been what I've been up to.
Excellent. So I'm going to take Mudassir's comment. It's a relatively long comment, but it has a question weaved into it. The recent COVID-19 pandemic has destroyed the fabric of society and family relationships. The debilitating stress of coronavirus proves too pressing for women to withstand. In its wake, more women are getting divorced during the lockdown. I think more couples are breaking down. I think that's a better way of putting it. What do you think about that trend, divorce rates? I think it's an interesting question, but would you like to explore that in fiction? It's a very sociological question, so I don't know if any
Taha,
of
I
us
think we
can
need
comment.
an entire session dedicated to this because there are a couple of
Exactly.
questions in it, and I have too much to say. So
There's a lot to say. It's too
Also,
sociological.
the last
Let's
part.
move on to the
Why you have to
next
say the last part that
comment
I
or
can't read
question.
it clearly. But he says, "What do you think? It is patriarchy that is more dangerous for women." I think
Huh.
it's. I think in today's world, I would like to say that both men and women are really equal, can be equally vicious, if you know what I mean. It
Exactly.
doesn't have to be a man or a woman because it depends on the human being, the type of human being who's involved. It can be a man, it can be a woman, but if you are vicious, then you are vicious, and then the family will break up, whether there's a pandemic or not.
Okay.
I think my answer to that question is simple. Women have been fighting patriarchy for centuries. We've been fighting coronavirus for about a year, so I think it's quite clear which one is the bigger battle.
Bigger battle. There you have it. Usman Hanif, who is also a writer, has a comment for Safina. You can see the comedy training in her post. So, are you working on a comic novel, Safina?
thank you, Usman, for the question. It's not a comic novel, but I think there are parts which are lighter vein in the manuscript that I'm working on right now. But it is also it's got a very strong female perspective. So a lot of women's issues are being addressed in the novel. I do hope to come up with something comic, just for the record. I mean, maybe a short story because I don't know if I can follow through the satire and comic references in an entire novel.
Okay, can we have another comment or a question? And Okay, this is a comment for Natasha. This, I think, appeared during the readings, so people seem to be liking your readings. Um, we have a lot of comments pouring in apart from this as well. Um, hold on. This is Usman again. How did all of you find the distance to write about the pandemic during the pandemic? What do you have to say about that?
I would say, why do you need a distance? If you are writing something about something, then, you just write. There are different ways of writing about things. If there's not a distance, then you write about that particular thing in a particular way. I don't think distance is needed.
I'd also argue that maybe if this compilation had come out 5 years from now, it would be a very different landscape altogether. We probably wouldn't be writing about the nitty-gritties of our lives in the same way. Maybe we would be writing it in a different way.
Yeah,
I
it
think
might
it worked to our advantage as well, because we were sort of in that situation, and it was easier to feel, for yourself and for others. So there were issues that one would not address, right now. But 6 months ago, they seemed more active and more real in our sort of environment.
Excellent. So we seem to be running out of time, but we have a lot of comments pouring and a lot of love and congratulations. So I just wanted to thank all of you for being here, Safina, Shabano, and Natasha.
Thank
And
you.
this is actually the final session of our series. And I just wanted to thank everyone for tuning in for the last 8 episodes and watching sessions, sending their love, sending their appreciation. About 6 months ago, my co-editor and I began working on this book, and it has now flown out of our hands. We know now that there are not just 2 editors who are working on this. This book belongs to 26 authors and subsequently has another life in the hands of the readers. So we do hope that people enjoy the book and enjoy the stories of these three esteemed panelists here. Do you have any closing thoughts before we bid farewell?
Well, I would say thank you. Thank you, Taha, and thank you. It was very nice talking to both you, Safina, and Natasha. And I think both of you, Taha and Sana, you've done a great job. It's a very interesting book, and I'm very happy about it. In today's scenario in Pakistan, I'm glad so many good books are coming. And your effort was really very good. I mean, I'm not saying it because my story is in there, but yes, it is a great effort, and you've put together a lot of very interesting stories. Congratulations again.
Thank you so, thank you so
I just
much.
want to say you excellently moderated. It was a beautifully moderated session. All your questions were on point, and you had really wonderful follow-up comments. So it's rare to see a moderator as skilled as you.
Yes, I have a day job now. So
No, I think my parting words would just be that it's so excellent that the compilation has so many different flavors. You get to listen to so many stories, so many different perspectives of what people are going through, and it's such a good mix of people from different places, different cities, different social structures, even relationships in a completely different manner. There's single people, divorced people, there's middle-aged, older lot. So it's a lovely collection, and I'm so glad the way you and Sana both conducted these discussions also were absolutely brilliant, because we got to speak to, or we got to see rather, different writers talking about their characters and how they sort of came up with their stories.
that's great. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you all of you for taking out the time. Please do get a copy of The Stained Glass Window. It's available at Liberty Books, and thank you, Liberty Books, for this platform. And goodbye and take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.